There's so much stuff out there arguing we don't have free will at all. Sam Harris wrote a book against free will. There's been a recent one by Robert Sapolsky. So can you talk to a little bit about some of maybe the misconceptions or why these sorts of views are appealing?
I think part of what's driven a lot of the neuroscience is just this kind of confusion about levels, right? I mean, it is the thought that neurons don't have free will, therefore we don't have free will. And I think that's just a fallacious argument, right? I mean, it just muddles up the descriptions that are appropriate to different levels.
Today I speak with Professor Richard Holton about free will. He is a Fellow of the British Academy and a Professor of Philosophy at Cambridge University. He has written numerous papers, including many on free will, philosophy of action and moral psychology. He has also written a book published by Oxford University Press entitled Willing, Wanting and Waiting. We discuss the various positions in the free will debate and their relation to determinism, psychology and neuroscience. Professor Holton explains where the free will denialism coming out of science goes wrong and how to best understand how free will fits with our current science. I hope you enjoy. Okay, Richard, well, thank you very much for coming on to talk to us today. We're going to jump straight in. Talk about free will, but so that people have sort of an idea as to what's going on in some of these debates, could you just start by giving us a brief summary of the various metaphysical positions in the landscape on free will?
Okay, so well, I mean, the traditional way of doing this, I suppose, is you might or might not believe that determinism is true. That is, you might not believe that how things were in the past fixes how things are in the future. Right. So, one way of thinking of that is if you've got all the facts as they were and all the laws of nature, then there's no other way for things to work out. So if you believe in determinism, there are then two possibilities. You either think free will is not compatible with determinism, in which case, if you believe in determinism, you've got to drop the free will. So that normally gets called hard determinism. Alternatively, you might think, no, there's a way of making these two things compatible. And so that gets called compatibilism, right? So that is thinking of free will and determinism as being compatible. Alternatively, you might think, oh, free will and determinism aren't compatible, but that shows I should give up on determinism. And so that's the position that's normally known as libertarianism or something like that. I mean, those are not hard and fast positions, I think, because one of the complexities here is when people ask, well, what do you mean by free will? People normally say, well, what we mean by free will is what the ordinary people mean by free will, right? So you need to do some kind of analysis of that. Well, of course, when you start to analyze that, you realize that people have all sorts of views about free will. So some of those you might think are very plausible, some of them you might think are complete rubbish, right? So you might want to pick and choose between the views that you want to hang on to. So compatibilists come in a kind of range of flavors, from people who buy an awful lot of what people ordinarily say, to people who want to criticize that quite a lot and filter through the intuitive views people have about free will and say, well, this one's acceptable and this one's not acceptable, and so on.
Mm-hmm. So is it a case then that you think that what you're calling hard determinists, who effectively reject free will, and the libertarians who reject determinism to embrace free will, do they have sort of a similar conception as to what free will is?
Yeah, I think very often there's, it's one of these things where the extremes agree, at least on my way of thinking about this, right? I mean, because they've got a very similar thought about what would have to hold for free will to exist. And then one of them just says, well, it must, therefore, to some degree, the science must give way in the face of that. And the others say, well, no, the science isn't going to give way, so we should just give up on free will. So, yeah, I think the conception of free will that both of those positions often have, which is one of the, is often, well, I think of it as a slightly sort of magical view, right? I mean, you think of the free agent as something who kind of, enters into the causally determined universe and, wow, does something that's not causally determined, it comes from nowhere. That's the origin of the activity. That kind of view is often held both by certain kinds of libertarians, especially those who've got often a theological basis to it. They've got a Christian view underlying it or something like that. And by many of the people on the kind of hard neuroscience side who say, well, neuroscience has shown there's no such thing as free will, brand new discovery.
Okay, so judging by your tone, it sounds like you're a compatibilist. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, first and foremost, I suppose I'm a kind of naturalist. That is, I don't believe there are these miraculous things. I very much think we should have a naturalistic view of the world, and I think science is our best method of finding out about that. So I'm certainly not in the position of thinking a philosopher can tell a scientist what the fundamental contours of the world look like. And within that, yeah, I'm broadly a compatibilist. I mean, as I say, I think that the conception of free will that a lot of people have is probably a mistaken one. So I don't want to try and accommodate that. I mean, if they've got this view that free will has got to be something, miraculous, then no, I certainly don't want to accommodate that. But I do want to think that what we think is important in free will, as Dennett puts it, the free will that's worth wanting. I think, yeah, we can keep that, and also we can make sense of what's going on, because, of course, if you're an incompatibilist of either form, you've got to think that something's gone wrong, and the kind of hard determinists think, well, people are just misguided, right? They've just got these basic mistakes in the way they're thinking about free will. And I don't want to say that. And in general, I'm in the same way that I think philosophers should, by and large, take seriously what scientists say. I think philosophers should, by and large, take seriously our ordinary intuitive views of the world, right? I think if we're going to reject those, we've got to have very, very good grounds for doing so. So, temperamentally, I'm sort of in the business of thinking, well, let's not just assume people are idiots. Let's try and accommodate what they say.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I think a metaphysics that's too in hoc to the latest scientific theory has sort of lost its raison d'etre. Metaphysics, I think, has to be something that helps make sense of human experience. Kind of more broadly, I don't know if you share that view or not, but
yeah, I mean, I do. I think, and I think for a long time, actually, I mean, right back to ancient times, philosophers have often been in the business of trying to reconcile the findings of science with ordinary thought, or at least the picture of ourselves which we have. And, there's a range there. So some philosophers are more likely to reject the intuitive view for whatever reason, and others are more keen to accommodate it. So some are out and out skeptics. But, I think philosophy, it's been the task of philosophy for very, very long time to try and mediate between these, what can look like warring factions. Yeah, and it's our intuitions, but it's also, I think, kind of our experience, or the phenomenology of free will. Yeah, exactly. So I think it's so I mean, in general, I think we have to both try and take seriously what people believe, but that's defeasible because we believe all kinds of things because of the Sunday school we went to or whatever. Our practices. That is, the ways that in this debate, how we hold people responsible, the ways we try and change how people act and so on. And also the phenomenology, right? I mean, what I very often in my, I give a first year set of lectures on free will, and I say to people, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to lift your left hand or your right hand. You can choose which. Now, think about that. What does it feel like choosing which one to lift? And most people get a kind of phenomenology of freedom there. I think, I could do this one, I could do that one. Now, that might be completely illusory, but I'm interested in trying to see what's right about that, because I think if we just throw all of that out, then we lose something which is fundamental to our views of ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, even if it is illusory, I think you're dissatisfied unless you have some explanation of why that illusion would even exist anyway. So there needs to be some kind of, I think, encounter with the phenomenology of it. I mean, I know there are some philosophers who are happy to say, well, it doesn't fit my theory, so it must just not be. Yeah. I think some do that with consciousness and so on. But yeah. Okay, great. So
there are times when I think that's the right response, right?
Okay.
But I'm not so keen on is this kind of swashbuckling, Okay, so the first move is just to think that we just throw all that out. That's slow down a bit. Think a little bit about what might be going on there, and let's try and disentangle some of these things. I mean, I find always as a philosopher what I'm trying to do is to make people slow down a bit.
Okay, sounds like good advice. All right, so as a compatibilist, then you would only, you don't think that we need to abandon all of our understanding of our intuitions about free will or the phenomenology of free will, that some of it can be remained, but you also take seriously, presumably, the possibility of determinism. I don't know whether you think we have to accept determinism. But can you, before we get to that, maybe could you say what kind of free will you think is compatible? What kind of free will is it you're setting out to defend?
Okay, so, well, here's something I'm not setting out to defend. Philosophers for many years were in the business of giving analyses of things. Do your epistemology, you analyze knowledge. You do causation, you give an analysis of what causation is. And I think one of the things that's been very, very striking about philosophy in the last, I guess, 30 or 40 years is that people have just realized how hopeless almost all of those analyses are. And so they've pretty much, most people have given up on that, right? Some people are still in that business. But we're left with this term analytic philosophy, which suggests that what we're doing is giving analyses of things. But I think most people aren't, right? Nowadays, most people think, oh, maybe an analysis just isn't available. That is an account of something in other terms, which, exhaustively characterize what it is. What you can do is say lots of interesting things about it. So with knowledge, you can say, so what does knowledge entail? What role does it play in our lives? All these, lots of interesting philosophical questions. So I want to do that with free will, right? That is, I do not want to give an analysis of free will. There's a lovely piece on this by Bill Lycan many years ago where he said, most compatibilists have been put on the wrong foot because people ask them to give an analysis of exactly what free will is, and that just doesn't work. So instead, I think what we should be in the business of doing is some of these things, thinking about, okay, so how does it fit into our practices? What kinds of psychological phenomena should be there? What kind of account should we give of the phenomenology, and so on and so forth. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in doing that, especially by thinking about what psychology tells us and what neuroscience tells us there. And also by thinking a lot about what our practices are. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in the kind of conception that we have of ourselves and how that fits in with what the social psychology and other forms of cognitive psychology have to say about us. And I'm temperamentally kind of anti-reductionist. That is, I think we need lots and lots of moving parts. I think people are complicated, and one thing that philosophers, especially analytic philosophers, have historically had a tendency to do is to try and reduce things to a few fundamentals. And by and large, I think that doesn't work. So, historically, lots of people have tried to give an analysis of free will in terms of beliefs and desires, say. And I think that, hopeless, absolutely hopeless way of going on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right.
Well, a negative characterization of what I want to do. But
yeah. Okay. So, but I mean, sort of a first take on trying to understand free will, you often come across these two different sort of what seem to be desiderata or our intuitive conception of what ingredients would be involved. One is something to do with sourcehood, and another is something to do with alternative possibilities. Yeah. And having listened to your lectures, you do look at these two different ideas that seem to be something to do with free will. Free will seems to require something to do with the possibility of having done otherwise, something to do with a way of assigning some active role that you have played. So a reflexive move of your leg, we don't think was a free will action.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah. So I think, part of what you're doing is to try and contrast the actions that you want to think of as free from the actions you don't want to think of as free. And I think that then, that comes up in the phenomenology, right? So, sneezing typically is not a kind of freely determined thing. You can control your sneezes to some extent. Very few people can actually produce a sneeze. The knee-jerk response when your knee is tapped by a doctor with a little hammer, that's completely outside your control. So there are things, which we intuitively think of as not within our control. I certainly can't regulate my immune system, which is, going about its business completely independent of what I'm trying to do. So that contrasts with other actions where we're clearly, at least it feels like, I decide what to do, I form an intention, and then I do it. So I want to look at that contrast. I also think it does tie in with these issues around moral responsibility. Moral responsibility has become a bit of a term of art in philosophy, I think. It's quite interesting when you look at the notion of responsibility. You realize people weren't really talking about it until the late 20th century. It's a recent way of thinking about things. People talk about blame, whose fault it was, things like that. But this kind of a notion of exactly what is moral responsibility, I think, has become a bit of a recent preoccupation. So I'm a little bit skeptical of some of the ways this is formed, but certainly issues about, blame and when we hold people in a certain way, hold them, as we would say, responsible for what they're doing. Your account of free will wants to fit some way into that. Mm-hmm. But I think that the connection actually between those notions of responsibility and the kind of phenomenology of it and the talk about what you could have done otherwise is not direct. And I think, we actually do hold people responsible for all kinds of things which were not, in a sense, freely done. For instance, negligence, things like that. So I think all of these connections are complicated.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I've purposely tried to give our talk a bit of structure. So I was going to leave the connection with moral responsibility more specifically towards the end, and focus on the metaphysics of it.
Yeah.
So it sounds then as though you're wanting to defend a relatively loose conception of free will that accords with phenomenology. It needs to be something that can distinguish between certain acts that we intuitively want to call freely decided or freely willed, and those that we don't, and that some of these notions, as long as we're not being too strict about them, something to do with the alternative possibilities, or something to do with control, maybe have to play a part. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair? Right. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So, if this is the kind of free will sort of conception that you are sort of starting with as the free will that's worth having, as you mentioned, do you feel the need to take any kind of position on determinism, or is that just something you bracket out and ignore and just concentrate on the phenomenology?
Yeah, so I think we do need to worry about determinism to an extent. I actually think there are two different conceptions of determinism which are in play here. So one is the sort of traditional one that philosophers have been looking at for a very long time. And the other is something which I've seen more in recent work in some of the kind of apparent or the challenges which people think neuroscience puts to free will. So let me start by kind of distinguishing those two senses of determinism and then go on to the one that I'm most interested in. So the one I'm less interested in, you sometimes hear people say things like, look, everything we do is just determined by what our neurons do, right? And our neurons are just, they're just little chemical things that don't have free will. So if we just reduce to our neurons, then we don't have free will. End of story. So that's a determinism of levels. That's saying that, what happens at one level determines what happens at another level. So you might say, what the physics ultimately, and then the chemistry, and then whatever, the neuroscience determines what we do. I think that kind of levels argument is just kind of mistaken. At least, so for instance, Locke famously worried when he looked through a microscope at very small things that they didn't seem to be coloured. And he thought, well, if little things aren't coloured and we're made out of the little things, then nothing big can be coloured. At least I think that was one of the streams in Locke's kind of concern here. But I think that's just a mistake. There are lots of things where properties emerge as you move up through the levels, which are not properties of the things which make up those things. So colour is a good example, I think. It's certainly true that subatomic particles are not coloured. They're much too small to be reflecting light, which would give rise to their colour. But they can make up entities which themselves are coloured. And of course, lots of things are like that, right? I mean, being a brain, that's not a property of a neuron, right? I mean, but put enough neurons together in the right structure with all the other things that are needed for a brain, then you get a brain. But being a brain isn't a feature of those lower things. So I don't think it follows immediately at all that, if you think that at the lower level we're made up of objects which don't have free will, we can't have free will at some kind of higher, supervenient level, as philosophers would say. So that's, that sense, you can think of that as a kind of synchronic determinism. I think that's not really a worry, and I think that's just a kind of confusion.
Okay, let me jump in here because I know I'll try and clarify things a little bit, because this is the discussion that I was thinking we'd have later, but let's have it now since we're broaching it. So a lot of people are going to hear that and just say, but that's just wacko, right? That's crazy. I mean, unless you're going to be a dualist, well, of course we are our brains. Of course we are our neurons. If our neurons are in state A, and that state A results in state B, followed by state C, and so on, then, and if that is determined, that what more could be could not be determined that same way at the level. So there's that.
Yeah. You've jumped there to the other sense of determinism, though.
Okay. All right. So synchronic determinism that you're talking about, then, let me to confirm for people listening, is then not the idea of a sequence of states through time.
No.
The idea of states that coexist seem to be sort of simultaneous, but they may be given different descriptors.
That's right. Well, there are different levels, so you're describing them at different levels. So, I mean, we could look at a plant as well, or we could look at all sorts of different things, or we could look at a television screen. Right? A television screen is made up of these little tiny pixels, at least used to be when I used to know how they work. God knows how they work nowadays. But or a newspaper picture is made up of these little tiny pixels, and in the philosophical terminology, the picture overall supervenes on that tiny arrangement, right? So if you've got a photograph of Donald Trump, no one of the little pixels makes up a photograph of Donald Trump, right? They've got to be arranged in a certain way. And when you look at them at the level of the photograph, then yeah, they make up a picture of Donald Trump. But the property of being, Donald Trump resembling, well, that's true of the photograph, is not true of any one of the pixels, right? The pixels are too small to be in the business of doing that. They're just either on or off, they're one color or another, whatever. Mm-hmm. So I certainly don't think it follows that someone can say, look, we're just made up of neurons. Our brains are made up of these neurons. I mean, of course, not just neurons, it's neurons and a whole load of other stuff, right? But yeah, of course, that's right. They're made up of that. Therefore, any account of how they work is going to have to look to the account of how those things work. Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't follow that any property which is a property of the organism overall, of the human being or the plant or whatever organism we're looking at, has to be a property of each of its parts. So that very, very quick argument, look, we're just neurons don't have free will, therefore we don't have free will, I think is just confused. But there's another argument which you alluded to standing behind that, which is not a diachronic argument, but is a synchronic argument, right? It's an argument about things happening over time. And that's the thought that, look, one set of neurostates causes another set of neurostates, causes another set of neurostates. And if we can explain the causation that's happening there, then we've explained everything that's happening. Right. Now that's a much more substantial issue, I think. And in particular, the historical issue about, look, if that basic underlying framework is determined, then what happens at any, as philosophers would say, supervenient level, that is, at any level that kind of sits on top of that, itself must be determined. And I think that's a worry about determinism, which is a very, very old worry. And we can talk about that if you like, the history of this. And it's got a recent manifestation in the arguments from neuroscience. And I think that has to be taken very seriously.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, so there's one sort of determinism you're putting aside, which is a reductive determinism that assumes that any property of our mind or of our brain would have to be a property of its components, and that just, as you point out, doesn't follow in almost any sphere. That there are properties that you can predicate of a whole that are not predicable of the parts of that whole, even if you think the whole is constituted by those parts exclusively. So you don't have to have the dualist idea of a mind as somehow separate from or independent from the brain to have an emergent property at the level of the brain. So can I just check then, Richard, are you presenting a free will that is entirely materialist, or do you have any sort of panpsychist sympathies? Or
I have no panpsychist sympathies whatsoever. Yeah, I mean, materialism is tricky, right? Because it's whenever people try and define exactly what they mean by materialism, it turns out to be much more difficult than you think. So I'm always a little bit reluctant to nail my colours to any of these masts. But I certainly don't want any spooky stuff in there. And I certainly don't want panpsychism. I don't want,
Okay.
And I certainly don't want anything that's dualistic in the way that Descartes would be seen as being dualistic, or that, much Christian thought is dualistic.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right then. So let's just again recap and check. So you're presenting a free will that you think is entirely compatible with the scientific understanding of the world and doesn't require anything spooky. So it doesn't require an independent mind, doesn't require dualism, panpsychism at all. So you think you can agree with many of those that reject free will in terms of the underlying metaphysics that they have.
Yeah.
But disagree that rules out free will of the sort that coheres with our phenomenology.
That's right. And so, just to say a little bit about the kind of history of this, right? I mean, this has actually been what philosophers have been talking about with free will for a very long time, certainly for the last 400 years or so. I mean, before that, so there isn't really a very sophisticated classical debate about free will. It wasn't really a topic that is very much there in classical thought. There's some thought in the Stoics when they started worrying about things being determined, but you don't look to Plato and Aristotle for the canonical presentations of the free will debate. It really got going in the medieval period with concerns about God's foreknowledge. So people thought, wow, if God knows everything that's happening, how can I be free to do something? That picked up on some Stoic ideas. But, Christian theologians got very concerned about that. But then it got transformed in the early modern period when thoughts about a kind of mechanical universe started to come in. So, once you've got that idea that, look, as they would have thought, the universe is very, very mechanical. I mean, it's probably not a conception that much science has anymore, right? Mechanics is not a fundamental science these days, at least not classical mechanics. And then you started to get this worry, okay, how can you fit free will into that framework? And Hobbes is the great kind of early proponent of looking for a compatibilist position there. And the basic idea is, well, look, we've got all these different causal happenings going on in the world, consistent with this sort of mechanical picture. Some of them are the kinds of causal features which free will has, and others are the kind of causal features which free will, which are not characteristic of free will. So that debate has really been going at least since Hobbes. And I think of, most of the contemporary neuroscience as just basically filling in the details about the mechanics there. Right. So I don't think the debate has been fundamentally changed by things we've found out recently. I think we've just got a bit of a better grip on what's going on because, the very simple view which Hobbes had of the way the human mind worked, we know is false. Right? It's a much, much more complicated thing than Hobbes would ever have given credit for. Hobbes' view is a very simple one. He thinks you're free just in case you can act on your desires. That's pretty good first shot, right? I mean, you're just reflecting on this, no history. That seems like a pretty good thing. I mean, I think it's inadequate, because it turns out that you can, you could imagine someone who had the desires implanted in them by a hypnotist, say, they will act on their desires, but we don't intuitively think of them as acting freely. And goodness knows what the phenomenology of it is when in those kinds of cases. So I think, those very simple accounts of what it is, and those, of course, are reductivist accounts, right? He's trying to give an analysis of free will in terms of other things. None of those have worked, but I think the basic spirit there, namely, we need to look at the kinds of causal pathways which are the free will ones, and contrast them with the other ones, I think is very much the way we have to go.
Okay, so you've talked here about then distinguishing some causal pathways that intuitively fit with what we take free will to be, but you're also not trying to present an analyzed or reductive account. But of course, there are accounts that are put forward by the likes of Frankfurt, for example, where this is a free will decision if our second order desires and volitions match up. So, are there reasons why you don't go that route, or what you don't like about, say, a Frankfurt style position? And maybe you could explain that a little bit to people, and how that differs from you.
So, the basic reason I don't like these accounts is they almost never work. Almost always counterexamples to them. And this, as I said earlier, this is just the history of recent philosophy, right? I mean, any analysis you give of anything, you can find a counterexample to. So let's talk through the details there. So Frankfurt, he basically looked at this sort of broadly Hobbesian thing, which says, well, you can do something, you're free to do something just in case you act on your desires. And he said, well, let's take some paradigm cases where we think free will is compromised. What about an addict who, thinks that they are going on consuming whatever drug of choice they have, thinks of themselves as not doing that freely. He said, but nonetheless, they really want to do it, so that they are acting on their desires. So on Hobbes's account, they should count as being free. And Frankfurt says, well, okay, so we've got to think not just about your desires, but about your desires about your desires. Right? So just as you can have beliefs about your desires and so on, you can have desires about your desires, second-order desires, as Frankfurt would call them. And he said, basically, you're free just in case you can bring your first-order desires, at least the ones that you act on, in line with your second-order desires, or higher order more generally. So, in his view, the unwilling addict, this is the unfree addict, is the addict who has a desire for whatever that drug is, but doesn't want to have that desire, right? And to that extent, they're not free. So the free person is someone whose structure of desire is such that all the way up, this is at least Frankfurt's early presentation of the idea, all the way up their desires for the desire at a level below that will be in harmony. They're not kind of fractured between these different sorts of desires. Neat, right? Really nice idea. So he's, in some ways, it's quite like Hobbes, because he still wants to do everything in terms of desire, but he just adds a bit more structure to the desire. Now, instead of just having a desire for a cigarette, you've got a desire not to have the desire for the cigarette, or whatever.
So it's being able to do what you want, but also want what you want.
Yeah.
Want what you want.
And so on.
Ad infinitum.
Yeah, I mean, probably not ad infinitum, because we kind of run out of ability to understand what's going on at some level. But as far up as you can push it, that should be in harmony. Which sounds great, but then you just have to think, well, we go back to our hypnotist and we think, well, let's get a really sophisticated hypnotist who doesn't just, implant a desire to eat an onion on the stage, or whatever hypnotists do to you. They've read their Frankfurt, so they think, all right, I'm going to do a bit more than that. I'm going to implant not just the desire to eat the onion, but also a desire to have that desire to eat the onion, and so on and so forth. Right. And, intuitively, it feels like these are still not free actions.
Yeah. And, well, so you don't have a concern. An alternative concern would be not only that the hypnotist has somehow given you the root or fundamental want that drives the action, but just that the fact that the action was entirely determined by a want, and that want wasn't itself chosen or freely chosen, that would in and of itself rule out what we would want from free will. Do you not have that worry? Do you think that
Yeah,
free
no,
will
I do have that worry
is
too. So, and I think one interesting parallel here, I think, is with beliefs, right? So, think about what is it to sort of freely form a belief? Well, again, we've got a kind of contrast between the cases where you think that someone had a belief that was, implanted in them through propaganda or something, or some kind of way of getting a belief into someone which we think isn't really the proper way of getting a belief there, and the way that we think a belief ought to be there, right? So what's that contrast? Well, it's something to do with the idea that you think your belief should sort of track reality, so that insofar as, you've got good evidence for the way the world is, you should move your beliefs to follow the evidence that you get, right? And that distinguishes the sort of rational person from the dogmatist, whose beliefs to some extent aren't kind of working in the right kind of way. And I think there's a very similar thought we have for desire, which I think we should give some credence to, namely that part of the problem with the hypnotist is that they've just kind of plonked this desire in you, independently of your conception of whether or not the thing that you're desiring is worth desiring, right? Which is a belief. So yes, I do think that what you want, one of the things you want in an account of free will, is to think that the person is able to regulate their desires in line with what they judge is worthwhile, something like that.
Yeah, so this is where reason enters the question of free will. So we have, and anyone who's watched my other free will video will know that I think this is really important. That any kind of account of action that entirely reduces to desire, I think, is missing the broader concept to capture all the different ingredients and factors that go into any kind of decision. So there are, of course, beliefs, there are moral convictions, there are things that are not merely wants, but maybe fears, and so on. There's a whole lot involved that go together to make a decision. And I think some assume, and I'd be interested to know whether you think this is the case or not, that if we had sort of a full set of all of the potential factors or features that go into any particular decision, that the result will just be a case of them all kind of clashing together like Newtonian forces and sort of resulting in some kind of quantitative result that is what determines what we do. I mean, do you think that that's a helpful way of thinking about things, or? Yeah,
I mean, I don't think it's a crazy way of thinking about things. I think, in fact, human brains are structured in a slightly more complex way than that, right? That is, I think it's not just that you have sort of all these forces that you just the strongest wins out, but that you've got these regulatory capacities, which mean that, you can form desires, and yet you can then go on to try and control those desires. Now, of course, the control itself is something that in some sense you must want to do. But I think nonetheless, it means that it's not just a kind of simple battle of the strongest. I think there's a more complicated structure which the human mind has. And I think, the neuroscience is bearing that out, right? I mean, we want to think that we've got a more complicated view. And lots of work on the role of the prefrontal cortex suggests that PFC is in some ways regulating these perhaps more primitive kind of driving desires that individuals might have. Now, once we're in this space, now we've got a much more complicated space to start thinking about the ways in which we might distinguish between the free actions and the non-free actions. So, going back to the addict who feels that they're out of control, right, there it might well be that they think that, reason tells them that, the life they're living is not a good one. And, it's causing this terrible strain on themselves, on their family, the people they love, and so on. So they want, in some sense, to regulate that. But they've also got this desire for the addictive substance, right? And, you've got lots of evidence of how that's working through fairly basic dopaminergic systems there that are driving up a kind of strong wantingness. Is an area I've done quite a lot of work on with various neuroscientists. But that can be regulated, right? It's just very, very hard work to regulate it. And when you look at the measures of kind of cognitive work, all of those go up under those kinds of circumstances. And if people are not scaffolded in the right kind of way, very often that regulation fails. Doesn't always fail. People get off addictions. So it's, again, it's a complicated case. But I think that's the kind of stuff you need to be looking at when you think, okay, so the person who ultimately, doing their best to renounce these drugs and then they succumb again, you want to think, yeah, there's some failure of their freedom there. And that contrasts with the case of the person who really wants to get off them and succeeds in doing so. And you'll think, yeah, there's an exercise of agency that's happened there. And if we just kind of, say, oh, but all that's just desires and things, then we lose that crucial difference.
Yeah. Okay. So I agree I'm agreed with that. So just to sort of a specific question, I suppose. So now we're in the territory of recognizing there are all sorts of different factors and ingredients that go into this. I think the addict case, being one that Frankfurt considers, fits his way of understanding things because it's sort of like a battle of different desires or different wants. The desire to, say, be a good father, but also the desire to drink yourself silly at the bar or whatever. And that could actually be phrased purely in terms of desires. But there are other kinds of factors that come in. For example, so the notion of duty, the notion of sort of moral responsibility, and so on.
Yeah, which came in that example, right? I mean,
which was, sorry?
Well, your desire to be a good father. I mean, you might think of that as just simply a desire, but you might also think that you've got some appreciation of what your responsibilities are there.
Right, exactly.
That kind of cuts against your desires, right? I mean, you may or may not want to be a good father, but you might still think, I have to be a good father in some sense.
So in that case, then, if we allow for there to be these other factors, you might also be desire to charge at the enemy, but your fear overcomes you and things like that as well. You might not think that's free, but our actions. I guess what I wanted to check with you is that, do you think it's possible that we freely choose to do things that we don't want to do?
I do. I mean, I actually don't think we've got a terribly good grip on the notion of wanting, right?
Yeah.
I don't think it's something. I mean, there's no clear kind of, if you ask neuroscientists, well, what is it to want something? There's no obvious answer to that, right? There's a bundle of different things you might say. And I think intuitively, we make this distinction between doing something because you feel you have to do it or because you've committed yourself to doing it. And those might come apart, right? I mean, you might commit yourself to something you feel you don't have to do, but nonetheless. And, that we typically contrast with doing the things you want to do.
Yeah.
So, of course, then someone can say, well, there's some sense in which you want to do this thing you've been committed to. And I think, well, yeah, I mean, if you're kind of behavioristic, that is, you think you just read the wants off what the person actually does, then that's true. But then, of course, it's trivial to claim that whenever you do something, it was something you wanted to do. Yeah. So, I don't think we've got a terribly clear articulation of exactly what it is that distinguishes the things we want to do from the things we do for these other reasons. And philosophers always have a tendency to kind of just push these into one way or the other. But I do think, that there's a very straightforward sense in which you can think of a desire often, driven by probably a very fundamental kind of dopaminergic surge, right? That gives rise to certain sorts of behavior, and then the ability to control those, often, with a lot of work.
Yeah, so the notion of effort is something that I find quite interesting, but it complicates things even further. So
just written a paper on that. With
one thing, just when I did my my other account of free will, I considered sort of a chess example where I think, you're deciding between moving a bishop and a knight. You have a desire to win the game, or the desire to do whatever move is best for winning the game. But then when you've deliberated and you've figured out what you think is best, and you say settle on moving the knight, it sort of seems strange to me. I mean, a lot of people then have done what you've said, have said to me. So I said, what you're doing then is it's not that you want to move the knight. What explains your moving of the knight as opposed to the bishop, the contrastive explanation, is something to do with a rational process of deliberation. It's an intellectual reason to move the knight, that it wouldn't properly be called a want or a desire. Now, many come back and just say, well, but you must have wanted to move the knight if you moved it. And for me, it's then, well, whatever kind of want or desire may have preceded my actually picking up the piece and moving it, would have to have been derivative from an intellectual process.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, go on.
And if we just have the word want as this sort of blanket term for any motivation or any reason, then it loses any kind of sense of being out of our control entirely, because the move is that every explanation must be in terms of wants. And therefore, there has been no sort of agency involved because your wants. So I think that confuses a kind of emotional idea of wants, which do seem to be less out of our control. Our lusts and desires of that kind of more
out of our control.
More out of our control. Okay, yeah. As opposed, so wants get used for that, but then they're kind of blanket applied to things that seem of a very different sort.
I think absolutely. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to say that once you've, reflected on which would be the best move, and it's clearly, you're moving that knight. There's a, perfectly natural sense in which you then want to move the knight. But as you say, you shouldn't think that, that desire was at the end of the chain. Now, in this case, of course, you might be really wanting to win the game, so there might be some other want behind that.
Yeah.
I think in other cases, it's not so obvious that there's another want behind it. So I think in cases of lots of moral behavior, you just think this is what you ought to do. And someone says, well, do you want to behave morally? And you think, well, it's not really up to me, is it?
I agree. Yeah.
No, I just thought, well, gosh, do I want to be moral or not? That just, so I mean, again, kind of post hoc, you can think, we can ascribe a desire here, but it's not clear that the ascription of the desire is doing very much of the kind of motive work here, of the the kind of the thing that gets it going. Feels what gets it going is much more this more cognitive assessment of what would be the best thing to do, what are the things you ought to be doing, something like that.
Okay, great. So it sounds then that what you do here is you're sort of undermining the idea there's a straightforward way in which some psychological account rules out free will of the sort we take ourselves to have. The phenomenon of free will is threatened by reflection on the psychological processes that pre-exist the decision. Yeah. Okay. So and also you're not wanting to at this point then introduce some account. Presumably, how do you feel about the sort of reasons responsiveness sides of things, or the Susan Wolf sides of things? Do you think that's better than the Frankfurt?
I do. Yeah. I mean, I think it's much better. So I think if the basic idea there is that you're free insofar as, let's think about beliefs first, then we'll come back to these more repetitive things. You're free in forming your beliefs, just in case you're able to respond to the reasons there are for forming the beliefs, and then you can think you're free for your actions insofar as you're able to respond to the reasons which you perceive for acting. I'm broadly sympathetic to that way of thinking about things. It becomes complicated, of course, because then people say, well, so what are the reasons for acting morally, right? I mean, I can see why you might have the belief that it's sunny outside because you just look outside and you can just see the facts, but doesn't this require some kind of very strong form of objectivism about values or something like that in order to really underpin this? It does require some kind of objectivism about values, I think. I mean, that is, I think if you just thought, well, there's, all this value talk is just rubbish, right? I mean, there are just people's desires and that's the end of it. Then of course this isn't going to get off the ground. Quite how strong that objectivism about values has to be is then I mean, that's a question in meta-ethics, really, rather than a question here. But I think these debates kind of tie in. One ties into the other.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so to just summarize that, because I'm getting quite encouraged actually by this discussion, because I think when I present to you the theory that I presented in my video, doesn't sound too far off the sort of things you're talking about. So it would be that then, rather than Frankfurt just sort of seeing these ideas of these wants and this hierarchy that goes up to a certain point, we now have this other idea of reason, and that the actions that you take that are free are ones that are sort of flowing not so much in the Hobbesian ideas from just wants, but for reasons in sort of a broader sense. So presumably one of those reasons might be, well, the reason I did that is because I wanted that. The reason I bought that particular thing from the shop is because I wanted that. So that your reasons can take account of your wants and your desires and so on. But the reasons can take account of other things, such as what you're talking about, what we take the moral circumstances to be, or what we take our duties to be, and so on. And importantly, for Wolf, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's possible to be entirely disconnected from the reality of those values. And in which case we then are not free. We're like the addict, but not for reasons of sort of chemical addiction, but for reasons of irrationality or insanity or something.
Yeah, I mean, so here I'm less sympathetic to what Susan Wolf says about those particular things, right? I mean, so I certainly think that you can see the good reasons and very freely act against them, right? Mm-hmm. So, you're a corrupt individual, right? You can see that you should do the honest and good thing here, and then you do the dishonest, corrupt thing, and you do it in full knowledge, and in full knowledge perhaps that you're doing the wrong thing, right? I certainly don't want to say, okay, so that can't be free. And, some of the worries, I think, with some of the things that Susan Wolf says is that, it pushes you to thinking, well, it's hard to see how a lot of those things that are going wrong are going to count as being free actions. I mean, she pushes it a bit further because, of course, she thinks it's to do with having the capacities, and so there we're already one level up. But I think even with issuing the idea that it stems from the capacity to recognize what's good, there's a little bit of again, I don't want to be too reductive about this. I think that having these capacities to recognize what's right and wrong is probably a necessary condition for being able to exercise free will. But I don't want to say, well, here are the necessary and sufficient conditions for free will. It just is an exercise of that capacity in some way. Yeah. I also think when we're looking at the phenomenology of it, it ties into a host of other features here. So a lot of this talk has been just in terms of, we started with just desires and then we added in kind of beliefs about what's right. I think also human beings work with states that we intuitively think of as intentions, that decide to do something, and that locks in a certain strategy, which then overrules later desires and so on. And I think a lot of the kind of phenomenology around free will is linked in to our phenomenology about how we work with those intentions.
Yeah.
So I want the story to be a bit more complicated here, and I think there are lots of different features that come in. But I do think that responding to reasons is one of the crucial parts.
Okay, great. So yes, and I've read your paper on intentions. It was really interesting and really good. And I thought, the way we make decisions so we don't have to make them again later, and we sort of fix on things. It was an interesting part of the story. Yeah. I also thought, just before, the Davidson account of how we could, the weakness of will stuff, seems to be quite relevant to the free will thing. If we have this idea that with any kind of decision to make, there are hosts of reasons, some of those we want, some we moral convictions and so on. Your example of the corrupt individual can recognize that the right thing to do, or even the rational thing to do, might be to turn down the bribe. They nevertheless accept the bribe, not irrationally, for reasons, but the reasons for which they accept the bribe are because I want that extra portion in my driveway or something. Yeah. So there's still an account there, There's still an explanation of that action, even though there could have been an alternative action with an alternative explanation for it. In other words, because the right thing to do is not to take the bribe.
That's right. That's right. Yes. Yes. Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I think there are plenty of reasons for thinking that we must be these complex creatures, right, with these complex setups, just because we are, we're cognitively limited. So evolution has designed us, that's where my kind of naturalistic tendencies come back in, right? Evolution has designed us to cope with a complicated, changing world with limited resources. So we have to have strategies for doing that. And there's lovely big literature on bounded rationality, on, how you do your best in an environment where you can't really get to the bottom of everything. And I think a lot of the phenomenology of free will actually comes from that kind of structure, right? That we've decided to do something. And then, if we don't then go ahead and do it, we think, gosh, what's gone wrong, right? Did I just forget? Or did the temptation of the thing pull me in a certain way? And once you get into that thought that the temptation pulls you away in a certain way, then you're into the area where you start thinking, oh, my freedom has been compromised, right? Because the machinery that should be there for governing our actions, our decisions, and then our actions, is no longer working in the way it should be working.
Yeah. But do you think that we can still then freely choose to put in as a religious language, succumb to temptation, or choose to?
No, I do think we can. But again, I think there's I think there's a lot of self-deceit as well comes in here, but you can contrast the case where the person had decided to do a certain thing and then it comes to it and they change their mind. I think, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this other thing. And you want to contrast that with the case where the person just finds they've done something. Mm-hmm. Oh, God, look what I've done, right? Yeah. In that sense, there is a sense, I think, in which their free will has been compromised. Now... And, the phenomenology of that, right, is that, well, I didn't kind of weigh up what I was going to do. I just did this really stupid thing.
Impulsives.
Why did I do that? It doesn't make any sense. Again, though, this is one of the interesting cases where I think that our ascriptions of moral responsibility actually can come apart from that phenomenology of freedom, right? So, you do a stupid thing, you do a cowardly thing, right? You could have stood firm here and you run away. And you look at yourself, God, why did I run away? Right? I know I ran away because it was scary, but, why did I do this? Doesn't mean to say you're off the moral hook, right? So I think, our moral responses here are much, much more complicated. There's that lovely movie, what's it called? It's the one about the avalanche that comes, right? And there's the father with his kids on the ski resort. Force Majeure, something like that, the movie's called, I think. And, he runs, basically. He abandons his wife and his kids. And, did he stand there thinking, gosh, an avalanche is coming. What would be the best thing to do under these circumstances? Well, I'm a father, whatever. No, he just got scared and he ran away. Nonetheless, we think that's deeply morally significant, right?
Yeah.
Quite rightly, his wife thinks she's got damaged goods on her hands after that.
Yeah. So, maybe I don't want to stray into this too much, but it sounds to me as though there could be a kind of an Aristotelian understanding of what's going on here, in that these sorts of spontaneous, not having the time to really deliberate kind of actions flow from something to do with what we might call our character or our nature, that has been sort of, either it's due to sort of unnatural dispositions as survival-seeking creatures, or it's due to times in the past where I've always turned and legged it. That's become habit for me. But there are other times when we seem to have that space to deliberate, to set intentions, as you might say, and then those start to reinforce our other more instinctual responses in the future.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But I just want to stress here that when you teach free will, you typically say, well, we need free will because we need to understand moral responsibility. And it's as though, once we've got the account of free will, then moral responsibility will just drop out of it.
Right, I see.
And I think that's not right. I mean, so I think there can be these cases of fear and whatever where people just do things very, very spontaneously. Yeah. And there's some real sense in which we think, well, that wasn't really a freely chosen decision. But nonetheless, we don't think it's morally irrelevant what they chose to do.
Right, so free will is not necessary to moral responsibility, is what I'm hearing then.
I think it's not necessary and sufficient. That is, I think that we don't get an account of moral responsibility that drops immediately out of our account of freedom. I think there are many more features that go into that.
Okay, great. All right, so I wasn't going to do this now, but we seem to be so close to it. I was going to put to you the theory, and I know obviously it's a theory, so you won't like it, of sort of a better way.
Some theories.
I like some theories.
I just like the true ones and not the simple.
You like the true ones, okay? Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll see how true you think this is, because it is one that I present in this video. As far as I know, it's original, but it sounds to be very similar to what we're discussing here. So the idea was that if you want to understand what's happening in any decision, there are all the reasons. Some of the reasons you may be consciously aware of, some of them you aren't. But you through the process of deliberation, you consider the reasons, and then you decide to act. And that decision, I was taking the decision as the sort of event unit that could be analysed or recognised as having different aspects to it. On the one side, there are the reasons for that decision. Yeah. Then on the other side, there is what I just call the choice of those reasons. Yeah. And so you might be weighing up that there may be all these different reasons, and you decide to act. So my example is I'm deciding where to go for holiday. Spain has nice beaches and architecture, and Italy has nice wine and historic sites, and I'm decide to go to Spain. Now, that decision has the reasons for it, the beaches and the architecture, and that's the rationality for it. And then there's the irrational component, which is just the choice. It's just my selection of that. So rather than having this sort of Newtonian forces idea that my decision is just a result of the competing desires and their very relative strengths sort of ending up determining the decision. There nevertheless is this additional element in it, which is just what I call the choice. But the choice there's no reasons for the choice. The choice is the selection of those reasons for the decision.
You might think there are reasons for the choice, right? I mean, in your case, the reasons for the choice were the beaches and the architecture.
But I was trying to distinguish the choice from the decision. So they're the reasons for deciding to go to Spain. Yeah. And the choice is just that which distinguished those reasons from other reasons I may have had.
Right. Okay. I mean, but why isn't it that you thought those were stronger reasons than the other ones?
So I think at this point you can always say, ask for reasons for the choice. And I think if that were put to me, I might give some other reasons, such as, well, I remember that beach when I was a child, and I've always wanted to see Gaudi's architecture and so on. But those, I think, are just more reasons for the decision, because they are me trying to sort of unpack again, saying which isn't really much different to the reasons that I had. At some point, I think if I'd exhausted all the reasons, I just sort of throw my hands up just because I chose to. Yeah.
So, I think there are different cases here. So, I should point out Italy does have some good architecture as well.
Oh, I know. I just keep things simple.
Not Gaudi, but yeah. So there are different cases. So philosophers distinguish often cases of indifference from cases of incommensurability. So, there are some cases where it's just kind of blindingly obvious which thing to do, right? You've put a fishhook in your finger and you think, well, should I pull it out in the direction of the barbs or smoothly around the other way, right? Yeah, it's just blindingly obvious as soon as you understand what's going on there. You've got to cut it and pull it out so that the barbs don't. Right. So under those circumstances, it seems to me, you do make a choice, but the choice is clearly determined, in some sense, by the good reasons. Right? But then we've got these other cases which are difficult. And so, as I say, the difference between incommensurability and indifference is often put in the following way. So if you've got a case where you're already indifferent, I mean, that's like, you go into the supermarket and you need to buy some tinned tomatoes, and you've decided you're going to buy, the ones that the mafia isn't controlling, and so there's just one particular kind of good tinned tomato. But nonetheless, there are 20 tins of it on the Tesco shelf, right? And, 10 of those are as close to you, effectively as close to you as any other. So, you only want one tin. You don't stand there thinking, oh my God, there are 10 tins here, which one do I take? You just pick one, right? And that's just kind of random. So that you might think is a case of indifference, right? It just, nothing hinges on it. And one way of operationalizing that difference is you could imagine that someone put a 10p bit, taped onto the top of one of the tins. Well, you take the one that had 10p on it, right? That would tip it from being a case of indifference to a case which wasn't. So a little sweetness, as philosophers sometimes call that. In contrast, in the case of incommensurability, so these are the sort of cases that Sartre talks about and various people have talked about, so there's this poor guy in occupied France, and he goes to the priest, and he's got to decide whether to leave France and join the Free French to fight against the occupiers, or whether to stay with his aged mother. And suppose, you'd said to him, well, look, I can see this is a tricky decision, so I'm going to give you a franc if you'll stay with your mother, right? I mean, he would be insulted, right? I mean, it's not the kind of thing where, a little bit of money will tip you one way or the other. Yeah. So it doesn't feel like it's an indifference case. I tried once with some psychologists to operationalize this and make sure that this actually worked with real human subject. We just couldn't get any good results, but nonetheless, it feels so plausible that I'm not giving up on the idea. So coming back to your examples, I do think that in the case of the indifference, we go into pretty much a random picking mode. Right? And then it turns out there are, little features that you can use to predict what people will pick. So they tend to pick the last one they saw. They tend to scan from left to right, and hence the one on the right tends to be the last one they saw. There's a little social psychology literature on these kinds of things. But yeah, we're random. So if someone pushed you, what was the reason? You couldn't say. So the interesting cases, I think, are the incommensurability cases. And maybe your Italian versus Spanish holiday case is a bit like that, right? So someone says, well, I'll give you another £1. I'll take £1 off the cost of the Italian holiday. And you don't think, oh, well, that's tipped it, right? Take £500 off, that might, but £1, no, that's not going to make the difference. So then when you're looking for the reason that the person is giving, I think it's true, you very often can't give a contrastive explanation. That is, you can give reasons for going to Spain, you can give reasons for going to Italy, but can you give a reason for going to Spain rather than going to Italy, which embraces all of the reasons that you're already considering? No, right? Because you can't give a reason why the beaches are better than the food.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what I was trying to get at. I'm trying to get at that in any kind of decision we make, there is the reasons element, which we might think of as the rational element, and then there's something else in addition to that, which you could, I suppose, really that choice element.
Yeah.
And there will be times when there is a clear decision to be made. Do you want £10 or do you want £20? Well, there just wouldn't be any really reasons to choose £10. There can certainly be circumstances where, at least not reasons that would be worth taking seriously. In which case, if all your reasons stack on one side, like pulling out the bulb, what reason would you have for ripping your skin? Yeah. You wouldn't consider those. But in cases where there's a genuine the reasons of themselves do not immediately decide for you. There seems to be something else going on, and that sort of just. But what I just was thinking then is that the unit though is the decision, and we're just now kind of noticing these different aspects that.
I think that's right, and I mean I think all these cases. So I think these are the sorts of cases that very often, you push people to when you get them to think about the phenomenology of free will.
Yeah,
I mean the empirical work is actually kind of conflicting here on whether or not people think these are the paradigm cases of free will or whether they think these are the kind of problem cases. It just seems like there isn't an obvious answer there. There are just different aspects to how we think about free will that focus on one or the other of these. I think the other thing is that, we are not transparent to ourselves. So we think we're considering all of the reasons. But once you take seriously the extent to which, at the very least, we're, as I say, not self-transparent, so you don't understand what's going on. And then you add to the extent to which we're self-deceived, that is, we very often want to give a picture of ourselves which makes us come out of these things looking pretty good. And a lot of these reasons are really pretty bad ones, but nonetheless, we want, in the simple sense of wanting, the alternative. So we do the alternative and then we rationalize. So, whereas I do think the phenomenology here is really interesting and we need to kind of examine it, I don't want to think that actually the phenomenology reveals the reasoning that's going into all of these cases. So I think in a lot of these cases, actually, you can explain why someone did something in a very straightforward way. You can talk about their reasons. But those reasons are not accessible to the person.
Okay, great. So that's great. Let's move on from that stuff. Now, I think we have a good understanding of the kind of compatibilism that you're wanting to defend. A little bit about how the phenomenology might be understood, although not in entirely reductive ways. So, what about this then? Interaction with the kind of determinism that you think is worth taking seriously, where there can be this a temporal sequence of determinism. So here's one way that complaint is often put. For any action that you do or any decision you make, that is either determined, in which case you had no control over it. It was determined by things outside of you eventually, going back in time and after some previous state of the universe or so on, or even your childhood. Or it's random, and that this is a dichotomy. Your actions are either random or they're determined, and in neither case could there be free will. Now, this can be understood in different ways. One way in which I think it could be understood is just that the concept of free will requires something contradictory. It requires that what we do is not random, but it also then requires that it's not determined, and there is no space in between. How do you think about?
Yeah, so there are so many things are going on here, right? And it's another one of these cases where I think we've got to slow down. So, of course, the compatibilist line I was pushing is one where you can accept that things are determined, and accept that there isn't a space in between. It's just that you've got to think the determination is of the right sort. But let me pick on two elements out of this, and then we can maybe see whether we can put some of the pieces back together again at the end of it. So firstly, could have done otherwise, right? I mean, people often think, well, look, if it's determined, then you couldn't have done otherwise, and could have done otherwise surely is the marker of free will, right? And again, coming back to phenomenology, you think, well, it's the issue whether you could have done otherwise. When you talk with linguists about could, right, so could is a modal notion, right? And like all modal notions, they are relative to us. We interpret them intuitively relative to a set of considerations. So, putting aside free will, there's some dreadful storm and the tree by your house blows over and it just misses your house, right? And you come back and you think, thank God, it could so easily have hit the house. That's a perfectly sensible thing to say, right? I mean, and, if there's criminal liability here, right? Someone had done something and it could easily have killed somebody. That's something the courts take very seriously. And it's something scientists take very seriously, right? But of course, if it's a deterministic world, then, compatible with all the prior conditions and the laws of nature, no, the tree was bound to miss your house. Right? So how do you make sense of the could? Well, obviously, we relativize. That is, we're not looking at all of the prior factors, right? We're looking at the ones which are relevant to the thing we're doing. And that comes up in all kinds of cases, right? I mean, so, we're in Cambridge. It is 12:30, right? And I say to you, could you get to London by 1:30? Right? And you think, well, yeah, no way, right? But of course, if money were no object and you had the means, the RAF could fly in with a helicopter, some other air force in another country, and pick you up and easily get you to London. It's only, 60 miles or whatever it is, less than that, within an hour, right? So, and if we're in a physics class and we're talking about laws of nature, right? Well, can you get to London under the speed of light in an hour? Well, trivially, right? So the could is relative to a set of circumstances which you're holding fixed there. And that's just the way could works in English. So could the tree have hit the house? Well, yes, it could have done if the wind had been blowing in a slightly different direction, or if the root structure had been slightly different, or if the moistness of the soil had been slightly different. Any of those things could have resulted in the tree falling in a slightly different way. And that's what we're concerned about. So, when you start thinking, gosh, do I have to cut the other trees around my house down because they pose a threat? Those are the kind of features we need to think about. And science does that all the time, right? I mean, someone says, well, if you hadn't added the catalyst, would the reaction have happened? Well, it's a perfectly good scientific question. And if someone said, well, what do you mean? If you hadn't added the catalyst, we're determined, right? So the catalyst was bound to be added. You just think they were doing bad science, right? I mean, of course, we can understand what's meant by that. So I think that, the question then becomes, well, in the free will case, what is it that we want to hold fixed when we think, could someone have done otherwise? And that's where I come back to these kind of psychological factors, right? I mean, I think that what you basically want to think is, well, could you have done otherwise, even if you kept your beliefs and desires and your intentions and so on unchanged? Now, that's a difficult, that's not an obvious answer, I think, right? So we're not saying the whole world has got to be unchanged, but we're thinking, hold these psychological states unchanged. Could you have done otherwise? Mm-hmm. So I think, there's a genuine worry there.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll pick that up in a minute. Again, because I know where you're headed with the psychology, and I think it's an interesting place to go. But let's just look a little bit more at this couldn't have done otherwise, because I know it's a big issue. The idea that, well, no, things have happened the way they have, so you couldn't have done otherwise, and it's used to rule out free will, sort of a priori. Yeah. Now, you've given examples where in everyday context we need to make use of this idea of could, but there'll be people who say, well, yeah, that's just the way we talk about things, but actually, if we were being hard-nosed about it, no, the tree couldn't have landed on your house, and no, the catalyst couldn't have done anything else. But I think that there's a bigger problem for those that push that line, and I just wondered what you thought, because I haven't read it anywhere. First of all, I think the distinction between things that are determined and things that are random requires could it have done otherwise as a possibility. I don't know how to make sense of the idea that, say, that the radioactive decay of this particular atom was random. What does that mean other than it could have decayed prior to this or could have decayed later than this? So randomness itself, to me, I think, requires could have been otherwise in order to even distinguish the determined from the random. And it seems to me then, if you already have a notion of alternative possibilities built into the very way in which you distinguish what is determined from what is not determined, then you have no right to pull it out of the other context where you want to sort of consider alternative possibilities of the macro. Now, this isn't about scientific laws or anything. It's just about whether that kind of reasoning is appropriate. And I think it has to be. So that's one. The other one was, it seems to me, again, that the push against free will that requires a kind of like Van Inwagen style incompatibility needs to have laws of a certain sort. It needs to have physical laws of a governing sort, not Humean laws which just describe the world, but they need to be laws that sort of enforce themselves upon the sequence of events. So given the state of the universe, the laws dictate that I will do thus and so. Yep. But for that kind of conception of laws, I think you also need could have done otherwise, presumably, because I don't know if there are other interpretations of it, but the stuff of Woodward, I think, remember reading, that's often understood, well, these laws provide the modal closeness of worlds, that to say F equals ma means if the force had been double, then the acceleration of that same mass would have been double, and so on. So there needs to be, could have done otherwise to get the right sort of laws.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think most of the discussion about causation, even when you're looking at work by people like Woodward and so on, you're using counterfactual style thinking there. Of course, it's not the counterfactuals that Lewis gives. And there's some discussion as to how much you should actually think these are reducible to the counterfactuals, and how much you can just use counterfactual style thinking within thinking about the other possible causal trees that are available there. But yeah, I think all this thinking has to at least have the conceptual possibility of things could have been otherwise. Now, so maybe you think, well, in order to ensure that, you've actually got to think that the laws change. Or you've got to think there are little exceptions to the laws. That's what Lewis is pushed into when he thinks about small miracles and whatever. And all that sounds, it sounds very spooky and whatever. But I take it, I mean, pretty much all the scientific thinking there, I mean, how we actually do science is based on some conception of how things would have worked out otherwise, right? So that general thinking about causation, also thinking about the difference between the things which are determined and those which are indeterministic, which are random, as you put it, is going to have to be based on those sorts of ways of thinking. So, I think it's just a non-starter to say, we shouldn't ever go in for that kind of thinking. It just doesn't work. So then the question is, well, how can we use it? How can we... what are the legitimate ways of using it, and what are the illegitimate ways of using it? Yeah, but that's a different discussion to the kind of.
Let's go into that discussion now, because it's I think the thinking is that there's the idea that somehow the kind of Van Inwagen style arguments, which is that, well, when analysing what you could have done otherwise, you need to keep some past state of the universe fixed and keep the laws of physics fixed, and then have a look. Well, no, you couldn't under the assumption of determinism. But obviously, under that assumption, then nothing could have been different at all. Yeah. So it's a triviality. Yeah. But I think as well, there seems to be built into this a sort of a certain kind of scientism, that is that there is something ultimate about alternative possibilities when we consider them in light of past events and the laws of physics. Whereas what you're saying, and which is actually true of how we do any kind of counterfactual analysis, is you're not looking at some sort of privileged one-size-fits-all holding fixed of facts of past states of the universe.
That's right.
But something that is entirely related or relevant to what it is you are asking about.
So this is all contextual. As the linguists would put it. It's contextual. There are contextual parameters.
But it's not only linguists and philosophers. The scientists would be the same.
When the linguists are analysing what the scientists are doing, right?
Yeah,
that's what they would say the scientists are doing. So when the scientist says, or maybe an engineer, right? Let's get nice concrete cases, right? You're looking into some bridge failure, and you think, well, what was it that caused the bridge to fail? Yeah, you're thinking through counterfactual possibilities, right? And that it's just a non-starter for ordinary science to think that you would be forbidden from thinking, if only, that bolt had been replaced, the bridge wouldn't have failed, right? And someone who said, what do you mean? If only that bolt had been replaced. The laws of physics, given the state of the universe from the Big Bang, ensure that bolt was not replaced. And, we'll try running that in a public inquiry about why a bridge failed, right? It's just a non-starter.
But it also it's not really even privileged in the metaphysical questions either.
No, I agree. It's not privileged. Why would we think the metaphysical questions are so diverse from all the other ways we think about things?
Well, exactly. Yeah. So, right. So then, given that, then, one last thing on this, because the Van Inwagen sort of argument is a big one. I think some of the reasons for assuming there's something relevant about the past states of the universe and the laws of nature is because there's this idea that free will is somehow tied to a branching future style model.
Yeah.
Whereas it doesn't seem to me that the branching future style model has anything to do with free will.
No, I agree.
And so I think, would you be able to sort of say a little bit about why the branching future style thing seems to get lumped in with free will questions, or why Van Inwagen sets things up that way? If you haven't any views on it.
I mean, it's always very tempting to set things up that way, right? Because, I mean, I think a lot of people have already got some kind of motivation to want to go incompatibilist about free will. And sometimes that's a religious motivation, or, there's something standing behind that's really driving the thought. So once you've got that kind of motivation, then of course you're looking for good arguments. And this looks like a good argument when you first come across it, right? Until you realize that it's probably not an argument you'd buy in any other sphere. And then you start to question it. I mean, on the kind of branching futures way of thinking, I think that's just a natural tendency about how we think about things, right? I mean, because we do think of the future as open in those kinds of ways. So then we've got to try and make sense, if this is a deterministic universe, as to how we can make sense of that thinking. One way of making sense of it is to do with, our knowledge, right? It's to do with not knowing how things are going to be. Another is thinking, well, relative to holding some things fixed, yes, the futures are branching. And that's the way I want to think about it, that if you fix this, what are the futures that are compatible with having fixed this in a certain way? If I fix everything and determinism's true, then of course it's uniquely determined. But if I've only fixed some proper subset of the set of conditions, then that's compatible with a number of different possibilities from now on. So and I think that ties in with the epistemological thing, because often we know that certain things are fixed, so we hold those fixed and we think, okay, given this, what else is compatible with it? But I think it doesn't just reduce to an epistemological thing, because I think we can very often be interested in how things would have gone, even though we know, in fact, they're not going to, because we know these other things. So I think it's a more general phenomenon than that. And having that thought that compatible with some set of things being fixed, there are many, many futures open. That's just how we have to negotiate the world if we're thinking causally and counterfactually in the way that we do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. So that's so relative to holding certain things fixed and then evaluating what I suppose could have been otherwise is what will be. What will be under such circumstances, you end up with a branching future kind of.
So you hold these things fixed and you ask, what's compatible with this being held fixed? Well, all of these. That's because the things I'm not holding fixed will change across the different possibilities. And as those change, so the outcomes will change. Mm-hmm. So then, one interesting question is, suppose you think that the psychological supervenes on the neurophysiological. And suppose you think that the neurophysiological is determined, then do you get this picture which says, well, okay, once the psychological is determined, then there's only one possible outcome. I mean, I think, in fact, formally that doesn't hold. So Christian List has nice stuff on this, thinking of this in a more formal framework, but it actually picks up on ideas which, Dennett and many people had, thoughts I'd had a long time ago, that in some sense, the issue about determinism here shouldn't be an issue about the determinism of the whole world. It should be an issue of psychological determinism, right? If you're in these psychological states, are you bound to act in one way or another? But the nice way that List pushes this is by saying, well, if you've got multiple realizability, that is, there can be many different neurophysiological states which can give rise to the same psychological state, then because of that variance in the base, you could nonetheless have various different possible outcomes. Mm-hmm. So there's something, very attractive, I think, about that picture. It has its costs, though. So I'm kind of on the fence as to quite what to think about this. But
Okay, we'll get to the costs in a minute because I'm interested to hear what the costs are. But for people listening, let me just check that I'm summarizing you correctly. So the determinism that you think is compatible with the free will that you're putting forward is one that, well, I know the science might differ on this, but we could maybe simplistically think, supposingly we have fundamental particles that exist in specific space on locations or something.
Yeah.
The laws of physics, apart from certain areas where there may be some randomness, but at a certain suitable scale, the world will just march on in one particular direction. And we could, at least in theory, well, I know there are epistemological problems, but it could, at least in theory, have a way of calculating the future state. So that kind of determinism at the microphysical is, you think, compatible with free will, but irrelevant to it.
yeah, broadly.
Because when we're looking at alternative possibilities that could have done otherwise that's worth keeping for in terms of our decisions, is one that just holds psychological
It feels like those might be the relevant. I mean, I'm not sure about this, but it feels like if you wanted to get a set of things that you want to say, well, let's hold those fixed, then that's going to be, then that natural class would be the class of psychological features.
Okay, so why? So why is it more appropriate when analysing whether we have free will or not to keep psychological features fixed, and then presumably from the discussion we had in the first sort of hour, there are reasons why the psychological features don't specifically determine what you do. Why is that the sort of the privileged analysis as opposed to the Van Inwagen style sort of state of the universe?
The Van Inwagen style stuff, I think in general is going to give trivial results, right? It gives trivial results across all of science. So you've got to think, if you assume that people aren't talking theories which just turn out being trivial, right? Then you've got to charitably look for something that makes sense of what they're doing. So, it comes back to the very early methodological point I was making, that I think we shouldn't assume people are idiots. We should assume our practices hang on to something that makes some sense, unless we're driven off thinking that. Well, in the same way that we think, okay, so what are the scientists holding fixed when they're asking, could the tree have hit the house, or could the bridge have given way, or could it have not given way, or whatever? They're holding certain things fixed and not others. So, they're holding the laws of nature fixed, but they're not holding the initial physical configuration exactly fixed. Mm-hmm. Then we need to think about what to say about the free will case. And then, this is partly speculation on my part, but I think that insofar as we've got sort of some social psychology evidence for this, it's nice work. Alison Gopnik and Tamar Kushner did some nice stuff on this, kind of, interviewing young kids when they start getting the idea of free will. And it looks like, they start getting the idea of these kind of things around 6 or 7. This is an age when they get lots of these sort of psychological, slightly more sophisticated psychological things start coming up in their talk. And they've got some lovely quotes from kids saying things like, if you'd really wanted, the questioner says, if you'd really wanted this, would you be bound to do it? And they say things like, no, I'm not going to let my desires push me around. Or, I don't have to let my desires push me around. So it feels like you've got some kind of awareness that, the kids start to get some awareness of what it is that these issues of freedom are really asking about. And it looks something like, well, if you were in this psychological state, would you be bound to go one way rather than the other? So it's a bit of a jump to think that, okay, this is the thing that we want to hold fixed. But I think, it's not a stupid conception, and it's one I've been kind of exploring, thinking there's something plausible about that.
So that sounds then as though that's sort of a marrying of the older idea of our reflective experience of free will, kind of being backed up by what we see as the way in which that concept emerges in the psychological development of children.
Yeah.
That gives us sort of more reason to say, well, these are the sorts of ways in which the idea of free will comes from.
Yeah.
And so that's where we're getting our could have done otherwise notions. And we can model that in counterfactual reasoning by saying, hold these features fixed. And it seems like, at least from the stuff we've been discussing, that we can have all the same reasons, desires, and beliefs, and yet do not have a determined course of action.
Yeah.
Not always. Obviously, times we have no reason to other things, but that creates the space of free will.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So I mean, I think you can do a lot of this just by kind of reflecting as a philosopher from the armchair. Yeah. But I'm cautious about, someone says, well, I'm going to work out exactly what our conception of free will is from the armchair. Because I think we're actually talking about what is the notion that ordinary people use. Philosophers tend to have, bizarre beliefs, which are engendered from having done philosophy for many years. So,
No, never.
We shouldn't take all that too seriously. We tend to privilege, things that are probably not terribly important. So I think we need to get out and we need to have a look at the empirical work there. And, the stuff that has struck me most forcibly is actually that developmental literature. But, there are other things you can do. I mean, another thing, of course, you can do, which the X-Fi movement, as it's called, the experimental philosophy movement, has done, is you ask, typically they're undergraduates, or nowadays they're subjects on that you get from the web, and you just ask them straight kind of philosophical questions, try and work out what their intuitions about what free will is. I mean, I'm actually less keen on that way of doing it, because I think that by the time you've got subjects who are self-selected onto these kind of tasks, who've probably been thinking about this stuff for a while, all kinds of strange beliefs then start getting tied up. So, I'm keen to get my subjects a little bit cleaner than that.
I'll tell you where you can go to get completely clean random sampling. The YouTube comments on my free will video.
Okay. Yeah. Really not self-selected at all.
I've had the weirdest things there. Like people say, like, okay, if you've got free will, then fly to the moon. See, you can't, therefore you don't have free will. This sort of stuff. Like, as though to have free will, you have to be omnipotent or something.
Yeah.
So,
okay. But anyway, so that that's the reason for taking some of that developmental stuff somewhat seriously. But this is all very defeasible, and
Yeah. And then just to fill in the last little bit, the Christian list stuff for the listeners, the idea is that for any given psychological state, the exact brain state you might be in, or exactly where all the different neurons are, the particles are, could be different, and yet you'd still have that same psychological state.
Yeah.
So that's where there's the space for there to be a different paths that the microphysical would pursue, and yet have different results at the scale or the level of.
That's right. I mean, the intuitive thought there is that causal descriptions are relative to the scale, as you put it, that is, to the kind of level that you're thinking about. So something could be causally relevant at one level and not at a lower level. And that comes from thinking about how the counterfactuals work and with a counterfactual analysis, causation, and so on. So I won't go into all the details of that. But yeah, the intuitive thought there is that, as you might put it, you could have two individuals who have a different neuronal state, but the same psychological state. Now, if things are determined at the neuronal level, one of them could then perform action A, and the other one performs action B, where those actions are then determined by the evolution of the neuronal states. So we're talking about a synchronic determination, which then gives rise to a diachronic determination, which then gives rise to a synchronic determination at the level of those neurons giving rise to a certain behavior, or constituting a certain behavior, as I think we should say. But I think that, that shows the kind of the difficulty of these cases, because if you are going to think that there's sort of moral responsibility is attached in some way, then you realize, you take these two people, you take, Nathan, the good man, and Nathan's evil twin. Nathan does the good thing and Nathan's evil twin does the bad thing. But it turns out that Nathan and you and your twin were identical, psychologically identical up to that point. It's just you were neuronally different. But now, you're off the hook, whereas your twin is in deep trouble. You might think, well, there's some sense in which Nathan couldn't have done otherwise, even if his twin could have done otherwise. So part of this is just a worry about understanding counterfactuals within determinism anyway, which anyone who's thinking about those counterfactuals is going to have to confront, and you think about it in any case. But partly, I think, is a specific problem here for these issues about moral responsibility and so on, that make it kind of tricky, right? I mean, so why do we blame your twin and not blame you if you really were in the same psychological state, all through your lives up to this moment where you did the good thing and he did the corrupt thing? That can look like just luck, right? That it's just the lottery, and it's the kind of luck that libertarians have always had to worry about, right? And there are various things you can say about it. One of the things you can say is, well, actually, we do hold people responsible for the decisions they make, right? End of story. I can't go deeper than that. But you chose to do the good thing. Your evil twin chose to do the bad thing. End of story. It's the most we can say. But there's still something uncomfortable about that.
Yeah, let's get back. Well, I'm interested to explore that a bit when we get to libertarianism, which is, see, the view that I presented to you, I take to be a libertarian view, but there's nothing you've said so far that I disagree with. So I'm interested to see whether I've miscategorized myself. I don't think I have. But anyway, when we'll get to the areas in which I might think differently to you. But before we do that, there's so much stuff out there arguing we don't have free will at all. So before we look at the libertarian way of rejecting the determinism, let's look at the other side. So, and as you know, one of the banes of being sometimes being an academic philosopher is that people don't really read you so much, and the sort of stuff that does get read gets out to the general public isn't always quite so rigorous. So, I'm sure you're aware there was Sam Harris wrote a book against free will. There's been a recent one by Robert Sapolsky. There's, as I said to you before the talk, the Galen-Strawson's basic argument. And these are all different ways in which philosophers of various levels, or scientists or neuroscientists, argue that we don't have free will. And they're aware of compatibilism and they reject it. So now, you've said that this is not a recent problem. It's sometimes presented as though it's some great discovery of the last 10 years. We don't have free will. So can you talk to a little bit about some of the misconceptions, or why these sorts of views are appealing? You don't have to name names or anything.
Yeah. So, I mean, part of this goes back to stuff we were talking about earlier. So I think part of what's driven a lot of the neuroscience is just this kind of confusion about levels, right? I mean, it is the thought that neurons don't have free will. We really now discover that we're just neurons, therefore we don't have free will. And I think that's just a fallacious argument, right? I mean, it just muddles up the descriptions that are appropriate to different levels. So you can think that our behavior supervenes on what happens at the neuronal level. I mean, that's a complicated thing. It's not just neurons, as I keep stressing. But all that stuff, yes, it supervenes on that. But we don't have to think that the properties which we have as a human being are had by the mechanics of each of the bits that make us up. Of course, if you look at the whole thing, then yes, insofar as you want to think that we're kind of identical with our brains. I mean, again, I would be reluctant to say that. I might say we're grounded in them, or we supervene on them, or something like that, or our mental lives supervene on them. But there just isn't a straightforward argument which says that the property of anything at a higher level must be the property that applies at the lower level. So then I think that, the interesting stuff actually comes up not with that kind of diachronic argument, but with these synchronic arguments. So the classic thing there was Libet. So this was, quite a long time ago. So Libet found that there were these potentials in your brain that, and these potentials could predict what you were going to do. And he thought that this showed that there was something wrong with our conception of free will. And there are all kinds of difficulties with Libet's particular argument. I mean, it may well be that it's just kind of stochastic variation there. You just need to get it over a certain threshold. So this is lovely, more recent discussion of kind of reanalyzing Libet's stuff. But then other people, what's his name, John Dylan Haynes, his name is in Germany, had some nice stuff again where you could predict above chance what people were going to do by looking at their brains. I mean, for classical determinists, of course, none of that would have been a surprise. And for classical compatibilists, hence, not a surprise. I mean, all of the stuff we were talking about has been premised on the idea that determinism is true. And if determinism is true, then it's very likely that we'll be able to get predictions above chance about how people are going to behave, right? I mean, I don't think there's a direct move from determinism being true to prediction being true. I mean, you mentioned those epistemological issues. And so, in general, you can't move from the fact something's determined to the claim that you can know it, because it could be that the things are too complex. I mean, you may have a chaotic system there, and so it may be that you would never be in a position to actually predict. But nonetheless, it might be likely that you could get predictions above chance for certain things. Yeah, of course, that was kind of what was expected. Any compatibilist would have thought that was the normal thing. So if neuroscience is going to show us that something's gone wrong with the compatibilist position, it had better not just tell us more neuroscience. It had better say what was wrong with the compatibilist position. And that's what I think is lacking in so many of the, I mean, I haven't read everything that's come out. So much stuff is coming out, one can't keep track. But many of the things I have read, you think, well, yeah, this was we conceded this. Hobbes conceded this 400 years ago. You're telling us really interesting stuff about the mechanism, but that doesn't address the philosophical issues. You've got to tell us why you think this particular mechanism shows that there's something problematic about the kind of compatibilist views we've been pushing. That is the thought, yeah, it's determined, but being determined in some ways constitutes an activity of free will, whereas being determined in other ways doesn't. And I'm just not seeing how.
Okay. I was surprised to hear you say that compatibilism is premised on determinism, because I always thought that one of its virtues is that it doesn't have to take any kind of stand.
Well, okay. I mean, sorry, yeah. Compatibilism is premised on the idea that determinism might be true.
Oh right, yeah, that it's possible. It's not relevant to the question. Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. I think that what you said is important, because there is, I think, when more of this stuff goes out, and again, I think it's probably part of this move away from looking at philosophy as the domain of these sorts of questions to assuming that really philosophy just sort of holds the ball until the sciences pick it up, and that now it's about neuroscience can explain whether we have free will, and that's sort of given this idea that fleshing out the causal mechanisms of the brain somehow means that free will is now known not to be the case. And I think, because a lot of people have said this to me, that this is not a philosophical question anymore, it's purely a scientific question. And then for me the issue is, well, the scientific method just couldn't even in principle evaluate that question, because its methodology assumes determinism. That's the only kind of answer it looks for. So you just have the bits we don't know yet, the bits we discovered, and the picture gets filled out more. But it seems to me that yes, any kind of argument against free will coming purely from the neuroscientific point of view is just sort of an exercise in missing the point a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. I'm not sure that I would say that the scientific method is premised on determinism. I mean, I think the debates in quantum mechanics as to whether you understand, whether standard Copenhagen interpretation or whether you take an Everett interpretation or whatever, those are debates about whether or not to have a deterministic interpretation of the formalism there. So I think one isn't actually assumed over the other. Okay, yeah, I should correct that. But there is, but still, any kind of account you give is if it's, and this was something else I was going to talk about actually. There's sort of a mathematical determinism anyway, in that. We should at least be able to model this with ways that sort of connect. Yeah, but I mean, again, the formalism might or might not be deterministic, right? I mean, it may be.
Yeah,
probabilistic. Yeah. Secondly, I don't have a clear distinction between scientific methodology and philosophical methodology. I mean, I think, we're at one end of a continuum. And if you look at the great historical figures, I mean, they were as much scientists as they were philosophers. I mean, it's certainly true of Aristotle, it's certainly true of Descartes, certainly true of Locke, true of Hume. These are people who are contributing both to the philosophy and to the science. So I think we're just at a more conceptual end, and so if you wanted to say that ultimately a lot of that conceptual work is just a kind of science, I'm not wholly opposed to that. I think I just don't have a clear conception as to quite what it's got to be to count as science. I think philosophy should be broadly falsifiable. I mean, I think if you had a bad theory, you should be able to work out where. I mean, science is never fully falsifiable in that if you're prepared to take a number of consequences, you can defend almost any position. So you end up with some sort of common sense as to what's got to be held fixed in order to then falsify it. And I think much the same is true of philosophy. But neuroscience using the methods of neuroscience, is not going to answer many of these philosophical questions because they remain in place in the same way that questions about the nature of causation have remained in place. And doing science, it's not as though people say, well, we've got 2,000 years of science now, so we know what causation is. No, we reflect on the science to try and come up with an account of causation. It's good to have people who are scientifically well informed because then they've got a good take on what we're actually trying to give an account of. But those questions just don't get answered by doing it. I think it's just the same with free will.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the conceptual analysis of free will isn't really there. I suppose what neuroscience could do that would be relevant with the kind of position that we're discussing is determine to what degree our neurophysiology is determined and to what degree there is randomness there.
That's right. Good. Yeah.
And presumably, even if, and I don't know what the current state of neuroscience is, maybe they've discovered there is randomness in terms of neural activity, but if they did discover randomness in neural activity, it's not as though that would lead them to say, oh, look, there is free will after all.
Yeah, no, I agree, absolutely. I mean, randomness typically doesn't help with any of these. It just adds a further problem, right? I mean, and that was meant to be the kind of worry I was talking about when we were talking about some of the implications of the Christian List picture, that it looks random as to whether it's Nathan or Nathan's evil twin, right? So I think just kind of bringing in sort of, well, it could be one way or the other doesn't help, and it never has helped. I mean, sometimes I think things which are stochastic, so they're not strictly determined, but they nonetheless, there are tendencies and probabilities and things like that, to which there are exceptions. That can be helpful, I think. So insofar as, my guess as to what the ways neuroscience will develop is that it may well develop in ways where, we're never able to tell with absolute certainty whether a system will go in one direction rather than another, but we can give a very strong probability. That might be relevant.
Well, we seem on the face of it very compatible with free will.
Yeah.
And that free will acknowledges both the tendencies of our reasons and our psychology to produce certain behavior, but that this is not entirely, absolutely hard and fast.
Yeah.
That there are ways to buck it, take control, even if that requires effort. Like you mentioned, the addict. Maybe most people can't give up heroin addiction, but there are a few who do, and sometimes that could be. Yeah. Okay. So that's one branch of the arguments against free will, is looking at the neuroscience, and it sounds as though that doesn't really add anything to the philosophical question that has always been. It's filling out more sort of the picture of our understanding of the brain, but the philosophical question is something that hasn't really got to grips with the compatibilist view, at least, of free will. But then there's the other side, which are the kind of, well, what you do is just a product of how you're brought up,
yeah,
and your background and so on. Do you think that sometimes I've seen arguments that seem as though they sort of reel both of these as sort of a two-pronged attack on free will. On the one hand, we have this deterministic, scientifically based look at our neuroscience, look at our psychological experiments, and then on the other hand, we have a more sort of social sciences account, it seems, of how our upbringing impacts who we are and so on. Do you think these are confused when they run together? Do you think they need to be considered separately? Is there one answer to one and a different answer to the other?
I mean, they're clearly different claims, right? I mean, but I think they're probably not incompatible. I mean, I've never thought that the sort of sociological considerations are likely to force anything that looks like a real threat to free will, exactly because, no one has concrete sociological laws that enable us to predict what a given individual will do. Right? Nor do we have, social psychology that predicts what an individual will do. I mean, always with all these experiments, what you're looking for is predictability above random, right? I mean, no one thinks, you need 100% predictability in an experiment before the experiment is significant. So yeah, of course things influence people, right? Mm-hmm. But, yeah. I mean, if you're in the sort of reasons responsiveness view of free will, which we were talking about earlier, then you better hope that would be true, right? Mm-hmm. So you'd better think that people brought up in different environments who come to think that different things are important would behave differently. Yeah, it would be really bizarre if not, given the conception of free will that we were working with. So, I don't get it I don't see what the sociological stuff can kind of really add here. I think insofar as it's a threat which comes from the much more fundamental stuff. And we've talked about ways to think that's not an overwhelming threat.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So, have you got time to talk about libertarianism now? Just a little bit?
Just a little bit,
yeah. So, obviously you're not libertarian because they see this incompatibility between determinism and free will. So what is it that the libertarian wants to add to the kind of picture that you've given that you think is a step too far?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's not a clear, all these terms are up for grabs, right? Mm-hmm. So List sometimes calls himself a libertarian. Mm-hmm. Because he thinks that at the relevant level, things are not determined. So you could be a determinist about the fundamental level and not a determinist about levels that supervene on that. Are you then a libertarian? Well, not in a kind of classical sense, but there's some sense in which you might think you are. So I mean, most of the classical libertarians, I take it, think that you have something that really does intervene into the laws of nature, such that those laws of nature just don't apply. So you really have a kind of exceptionalism. And it's the exceptionalism that I don't want to have any part of, right? I mean, I don't want to think that human beings are somehow these radically different things from anything else that exists in the universe, such that very, very different kind of understanding has to be given of them. But if all you mean is, well, once we've fleshed out the picture that we've fleshed out, it may be that there are levels of description which are such that determinism is no longer true of it. And that's all I mean when I say I'm a libertarian. Then I've got no beef with that, right? I mean, I'm not, as I say, 100% convinced of the details here. I still think they're these interesting issues and they need more thought. But I wouldn't sort of naturally step back from that kind of way of thinking in the way I would if we wanted to think of human beings as these radically exceptional creatures.
So I'm going to admit I haven't massively read the literature on this, but let's go with the stuff I have read. So there's the Chisholm paper, the classic one that's on the reading list that I found interesting, where you have the idea of us as agents being the cause of our action. So that sort of appeals to different kinds of causation. You have is it transuent and imminent? I can't remember the exact names he uses. So you've got causation that holds between events, a relationship between events, and then you've got causation that holds between an agent and an event. And so at some point, I mean, he phrased this in terms of his causal account of something. That was caused by my hand. Is it the Aristotle rod moving a stone? The stone was caused to move by the rod, which was caused to move by my hand, which was caused to move by my muscles. You could even say caused to move by my brain firing. And what caused that? Me. At some point, you just have an agent as a cause, and that's a different kind of causation. Now, he explains that, I suppose you have a Humean account of cause, that might not be so problematic. Or if you had a kind of...
it's tricky on a Humean account, right? Because how do you have constant conjunction between... I mean, if the first relatum just is you, then it's kind of hard to get any account of...
Well, you could do it, but I mean, I can't remember whether he's a dualist or so on, but if you just recognized a constant conjunction between my decision to move a cup and that's conjoined with my arm reaching out and picking up the cup, it seems as though I could say that my decision caused that.
Yeah, no, that's right. But then this is an area where people have started to write again about some of these things, which is interesting to get going again. But I mean, my first take on that is now you've moved back to event causation, right? Okay. That's you doing something. That's you deciding. And some libertarians, so Kane, for instance, do want to they want to stick with event causation, but they want to think that the fundamental events are people doing things or people deciding things. Now, there is still a question as to whether kind of quite what the priority there is, whether it's an event or whether it's a kind of property of a person, and quite how that cashes out. I don't have a firm view on this. There's recent literature on this. I think a lot of the push towards having it not being event causation, but it being genuinely agent causation, comes from Reid. And I think that comes because he's got this model that God is actually the only actor. So that's the only real source of, causal happening, and everything else is just a conduit through which this moves.
So okay, so
scholarly literature, there are people much more expert than me on this.
Okay, so this is what I liked about the Kane stuff when I read it. I liked this idea of starting off with the event, and he gives an account pretty similar to the one we've been discussing. It seems to me on the psychological level, right?
This is in his paper or in the later book, or he has various different. In the paper, he has this interesting account. So he does want to think that the fundamental happening is a human decision, right? But then he wants to hang on to this kind of reason constraint on that. So he wants to think that there's a reason why the human agent made the decision they made. And you think, okay, so what's the reason, right? Doesn't that take us back to the prior psychological states before they made the reason? And he says, no, the reason they make it is because they evaluate the option that they choose as better. And you think, well, hang on, surely that is a prior psychological state, right? They make the decision first and then they choose. But he says, no, it's in choosing what they choose to do that they make that evaluation of one thing being better than the other. And then I kind of scratch my head a bit, because now we're in this very, very tight little circle. So what explains why they choose? Well, they made the evaluation. What explains how they made the evaluation? Well, that they chose. So we've got this very tight explanatory circle. Now, I'm not against circular reasoning, but I normally expect a bit of a bigger circle than that, right? So I'm very mystified actually by how that's meant.
I remember you making that complaint, and so that's where I suppose was the inspiration for the position that I put forward to you before, in that if we don't see this as sort of an explanatory circle where one explains the other explains the other, but we see this as sort of an analysis of what was originally a whole event, a decision, and that decision can be analysed into the reasons and the choice. And the choice has to be answered as the choice of those reasons, just as those reasons have to be understood as the reasons chosen. Hence, they are the reasons for the decision. Then you sort of see this just as as an analysis of what is fundamentally a whole. And then, but I mean, what would make that libertarian view? Because the stuff it's not in the paper, but the stuff I've heard of him, I saw a lecture of his somewhere. He still seems to think that his view would fail if there wasn't enough randomness in the brain.
Yeah. He doesn't say very much about that in that paper. I mean, in the book, he uses quantum mechanics and whatever in ways doesn't seem to me as actually terribly helpful to the account. But the thing is, he worries that if he's in a deterministic universe, then it's just going to be determined which choice you make. So there will be an explanation, but the explanation will be an explanation from physics. So that's why he wants to say this, we can't have an explanation which appeals to physical facts. So fundamentally there has to be the choice. The choice is the starting point, but the choice is explicable, but it's explicable in terms of the reasons, kind of unpacking the thing. So
but I could see why, if you could say that if we could determine that the choice and the action were one possibility from a randomness, if there's randomness in the brain, and so there's a certain brain state prior to the choice, and there's enough randomness in there that's the following brain state that represents that choice could have also instead been followed by a different brain state that represented a different choice, then he's got that sort of space in the scientific account of the randomness that allows you to have chosen otherwise. So where the interesting explanation, if you want a good explanation of it, you have to give the kind of reasons, decision explanation rather than the scientific one, because the randomness just leaves you none the wiser. Yeah.
It's just that the reasons, and this is the parallel worry I think that you get in the list account. The reasons can't be prior to the decision. I mean, they can't be contrastive reasons. They can't be reasons for you choosing this way rather than that, which are there prior to the decision. Because if so, you would think that this should, unless it's just bad luck that you go one way and the other person goes the other way. So they're going to have to be reasons which, my first thought of this, they're subsequent to the decision, right? And of course, that's a very common psychological phenomenon, right? You get this, what psychologists call post-decisional shift, that having decided it's on something, you tend to think it was the right thing to decide on, right? And that's comical at times. I mean, turns out, you ask people to choose which is the more attractive of two photographs of, pictures of people, and you ask to choose which is the more attractive. And then you ask people to justify why they chose. Meanwhile, the psychologists have cleverly switched the pictures. So you're given the person you judge as less attractive, and told you judge them as more attractive. And most people don't say, hang on, you switch the pictures. They start creating reasons as to why this is the more attractive person, right? So that happens, we get that all the time. And it's probably a good idea we do, because it's part of what keeps us from being depressed, right? I mean, But
there is a difference there, though, isn't there? Because the reasons reflecting on being conscious of the reasons that were part of your choice is different to those being the reasons.
That's right. So I think in those cases, what you think with those cases with the photograph choice is that they were so close. The person really could have gone either way, right? That's why they didn't notice, and that's why they can then confabulate a set of reasons. But then it really does feel like it's kind of arbitrary, right? You're not really giving a reason for why you've gone one way rather than the other. And I do tend to think of those as being like the tins of beans. What do we have? Tins of tomato case.
Yeah.
You got to pick one. So and these bloody psychologists are asking you to do this stuff, and you say, okay, well, I'll
only get to this.
Yeah, exactly. And then, you don't even notice that they switch. I mean, imagine it was the Sartre case, right? And, the guy in the end, he decided to stay with his mother. And then the psychologists come back to him and say, so why did you decide to fight for the Free French, right? You wouldn't create a whole load of reasons. He'd say, no, you misunderstood. I decided to stay with my mother. So I think in these cases where what you've got is something which is really incommensurable, and you find it very hard to give a reason which is a contrastive reason, a reason for doing one thing rather than the other, although you can say a lot of good things about this thing, then I think maybe, we just have to accept, firstly, that, well, what moved you one way rather than the other might have been pretty random in those cases. But that the agent subsequently then creates a self which justifies and locates that decision. And that is, going back to Sartre, that's the kind of existentialist choice, right? And then you create this new self in the light of the choices that you've made. I mean, it comes out better in Camus, in fact, than it does in Sartre. But you kind of create this person out of the void. But then don't think what you're doing in giving those reasons is giving you something kind of that justified from before. You do it post hoc. And then I think when we come to moral responsibility, you've just got to accept that, well, we blame the person who does that thing and constructs that life. And maybe there's no more to be said to it than that, well, they did the bad thing.
Yeah, so I'm trying to get a little bit clearer on then how your position is different from Keynes, especially as, people take these labels very seriously. Well, it's compatibilist or it's libertarian and so on.
Yeah.
So according to your account, you can have the same psychological states, and then a different decision is made.
Yeah.
Because that's what we're holding fixed. It could have been otherwise, a different decision made.
Yeah.
Isn't that the same as what Keynes is saying?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think he is saying that, except, well, two things. One is he thinks that that's not compatible with buying determinism at the scientific level.
So the difference is then that so it sounds like you and he have the same account at the psychological level, but he thinks that must be kind of grounded in a certain randomness in the brain, such that that it was possible at the microphysiological, or at least at the neurophysiological level, given the previous state, that the choice could have been otherwise. Whereas List is saying, well, no, that could already be set in stone, and we have the supervenience relation. So wouldn't that debate then actually not be a philosophical debate? That would just be a debate about the neuroscience. It just seems as though when we know more neuroscience,
it's a bit of both, isn't it? Because I mean, it is a debate about the neuroscience, but it's also that Keynes hasn't kind of philosophically noticed the possibility of the compatibility, because he hasn't noticed the possibility that the supervenience relation doesn't maintain determinism. That is, A can supervene on B, B can be determined, and A cannot be determined. So there's a philosophical disagreement there. And then there's just the issue about, the facts about the brain. But then there's this further thing, which is that I think Keynes thinks that he's really got a contrastive explanation as to why you chose one way rather than the other, in the light of reasons which I think you can only think of as subsequent to the decision, rather than as actually, justifying the decision. Namely, the agent has kind of turned themselves into the kind of person that thinks these are the reasons for determining, these are the reasons for them. But that's, it's not as though they do that, at least on Keynes' very account, it's not as though they do that prior to the decision. The decision then makes them into the kind of person for whom that then comes to be true.
Right, okay. I may not. So there's a few different things going on here. This is very helpful for me, actually. So on the one hand, I suppose, let's leave, if it turned out that at the brain there was enough randomness there, such that you don't, maybe there is a level below that. Well, suppose there just isn't at the level of the brain at all, this hard and fast determinism.
Yeah.
That would be helpful for your account, it seems to me. You don't need it, but it'd be helpful because it could get rid of that other worry about the evil Nathan and the good Nathan being purely a matter of what our microphysiology was.
Yeah.
Because it could be that our microphysiology was also this identical.
Yeah, and one just randomly went one way.
And then it seems to be totally open to say that, well, as far as the physicist is concerned, they model that as randomness and probability distributions and so on. But our phenomenology of it suggests that we had some active process in collapsing which way it went, or so on. So on.
Yeah.
So that would enable you to have a way to get away with, at least intuitively, that initial worry.
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting open empirical question as to whether we should think that the brain, it actually ties into questions about fundamental physics, right? Because ultimately, that's going to be the level at which those kind of decisions about the right interpretation are going to have to be made. So you could think of it as random, in which case, yeah, it's just that you could have gone either way, or you could think of it as determined at one level but not at the other level, which would mean that your psychologically identical twin but neurophysiologically distinct twin would have gone the other way. And yeah, that's an open empirical question.
Okay, so here's a different way I thought you could go, which is what I present in my video. And this is sort of drawing from Russell, but I think it may play in a little bit with the Reid stuff he mentioned as well. If we distinguish between sort of a mathematical determinism and then a causal determinism, you could accept a mathematical determinism.
You're going to need to gloss this a bit.
Okay, yeah. So the idea would be that you just remove the causal account that suggests there's some sort of priority to the direction of time, such that the previous state is somehow prior to the subsequent one.
Yeah.
Such that it makes sense for me to say that, well, given a necessary relationship between event A and event B, it's our causal reasoning that suggests that A is prior and is the cause of B.
Yeah.
But if they're merely linked mathematically, then you can logically go from B to A as well. You can calculate the previous states of the system based on the current states.
So in classical mechanics, you can, right? I mean, you can go in either direction.
Yeah, you can go in either direction in classical, but Hugh Price sort of updates that same idea, doesn't he, to sort of the quantum stuff? Because even entropy is just a change in time, isn't it?
Yeah,
delta time.
Yeah, I don't understand the theory, and I don't know the theories here well enough to be able to say anything terribly helpful, I think.
Okay, that's fine. So just on the conceptual level, it seems to me that you could have, and I don't know whether then, I assumed it would be a libertarian view, but it seems to me if you could accept a mathematical determinism, but not have the additional of the causal relationship suggesting that previous states are somehow prior to current states, in which case, given a decision, it wouldn't make any more sense to say that this decision was determined by some prior event the way Van Inwagen does, as a logical connection, any more than we would say that my decision determined the past states of the universe.
Yeah, you could. I mean, yeah. So, I mean, you know, if you worry about time's arrow in the way that Hugh Price does, right, and you think that, you know, there isn't a clearly marked direction of causation, such that, the prior ones determine the later ones, and not vice versa.
Yeah, because could have done otherwise is not causal, not fundamentally causal.
No, that's right. You can run that in either direction, right? If you're just, and I mean, you can run the counterfactuals in either direction. So I mean, if you do think that you can give an analysis of cause in terms of the counterfactuals, and the counterfactuals do run in either direction, then you can think that causation is going in both directions.
Or you could do this. At least I think. So if you could accept, I think, a mathematically determined world and have free will on compatibilist lines of the sorts that we've talked about. You can have could have done otherwise. You can have something of that sort. But if you wanted to add in this sort of more sourced conception that might be the worry about the evil Nathan and the good Nathan is that, well, hang on a minute, in what sense was I the source of that? It was just the microphysical that different, and that's not me. If you could think that, well, how things are mathematically determined and so on, that's a question in a certain line of thinking that's mathematical in form, logical in form. And then if we want to understand causation, we recognize the association that causal reasoning has principally to do with free will, that our idea of causation that adds to it something about sequence
you could.
Is sort of derivative of free will. So the scientists can carry on doing their mathematical determinist thing, and we get free will from a compatibilist point of view, and that's where our notion of cause comes from. It comes from deciding, and so then the decision, at least phenomenologically, seems to be uncaused. And the consequence of that decision seem to be caused, and that's where causation comes in.
You could, and that, you know, Hugh Price, Peter Menzies have, you know, account of causation, which actually thinks that interventions are crucial. And so does make cause into this much more human-based thing, right? I mean, I'm just I'm just, less anthropomorphic than that.
That sounds, sorry?
Less anthropomorphic than that. I really do not want to think that causation is basically a kind of human-based intervention style thing.
Richard, as you know,
it maybe we get our idea of causation from acting on the world, but I would think that the world would have plenty of causation in it without us. But we're into issues of metaphysics which are to some degree independent, I think.
Yeah, I think they're independent, but as I think I have idealist sympathies. I even call myself an idealist, and I think then from that point of view, that's a very natural way to think about free will, in that we have the sort of logical, mathematical, eternal, atemporal conception of the world, and that's all fine and dandy, and that is not incompatible with our more sort of our phenomenology of free will. Deciding.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think. I can't remember whether he was written about free will in this area at all. I can't remember anything of his on this, but I mean, I think I could ask him. Yeah, I think a very natural way, actually, of kind of pushing that sort of Price-Menzies picture of causation would be to think of free will as kind of fundamental here. Give a very it would be very crucial to our way of understanding the world. Would come not just through our own interventions, but through those interventions being free in the right way. So, I mean, I've heard him talk about the kind of general screening off issues and the ways in which those are meant to be kind of independent of the causal nexus in a certain way. But I haven't heard him talking about how that fits in with the phenomenology of freedom and, just how crucial a role we give. But if you're going to be an idealist, I think that's a way to do it. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So I think unless you're feeling lots of high standard, we haven't actually talked about the moral stuff that relates to this. Maybe would you like to pick that up on a different occasion?
Maybe we should do that. Yeah. Let's.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks very much for that. That was fantastic, Richard.
I look forward to seeing whether you get a random sample of comments.
Yeah, that's fine. I wouldn't suggest you read them. They're not always.
I'm going to let you read them.
I'll summarize the best ones for you. Well, one last thing I was going to say, though, just for my own interest, maybe. So that view that we just talked about at the very end, the Hugh Pricean, or the idea of having mathematical determinism is distinct from causal determinism and so on. Would you count that as a libertarian view, or would you count that because it sort of denies causal determinism, but it doesn't deny? It doesn't deny mathematics.
I mean, I think it is. I mean, I think it would, if you had to put it on the bookshelf, well, if I had to put it on the reading list, where would I put it? I'd put it in with, eccentric forms of libertarianism. Yeah.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
I'm an eccentric libertarian. Okay, good. All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for talking to me, and I'm sure everyone will have enjoyed what we discussed.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.